start, if it's okay for the last session, I want to start with a quick summary of what we did yesterday, so we have it fresh in our mind, and then that won't take a lot of time, but at least it'll give us an idea as to where we stopped and how we move from there. What we looked at yesterday was how to offer different strategies of reading of violent texts in the Bible. And if you remember, I took the text of Joshua 8 as an example of violent text, and how do we read such a text? We looked at three strategies. The first one, if you remember, was a theological strategy, and it was offered by a writer called André Neher, who was a rabbinic biblical scholar. And André Neher was pointing to the fact that it all relates to the theological question of the covenant. Either you think in the covenant with God, it's a master-slave relationship as a metaphor, in which case you are slaves and God tells you you do, or you consider that in the relationship you are in more equal terms, you are in terms of partnership, and in that relationship, when God tells you something, as a partner, your responsibility is to argue. And what he was pointing out is that in the book of Joshua, in the structure of the book of Joshua, most of the passages were made with temporality. The commandment was not very clear. There was a lot of time lapse. There was one city and then another city and another city. And he says all that points to the fact that it gave opportunity of thinking. And the point that he was making was that the book of Joshua, therefore, is here to actually show you, because it's a failure, because at the end of the day, the massacre does take place, and children and women and everybody is killed in that narrative. The book of Joshua is here as a reminder of what happened when you think you're a slave and you shouldn't be. God does not expect you to be a slave in the covenant with him, and therefore here there's a strategy of reading with regard to any sort of a religious mandate that you would read in the biblical text, and for which you have to be careful of what is your posture vis-a-vis that text. So that's one thing that we saw. Then if you remember, we looked at a rabbinic text which posited a more legal, halachic stand, which was the story of Ula bar Koshav with Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, and that was the story, again, in a violent context, the Roman conquest, and the Romans trying to capture someone and saying, if you don't deliver this individual to us, I'm going to kill the whole city. What is it that the rabbi here, Yehoshua ben Levi, needs to do? And sadly, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi follows the law. He says, I don't know what to do. I'm going to read what the law tells me to do, and I'm going to do what the law is telling me to do. And the postscript of the story is that the prophet Elijah, who used to come and see him, suddenly stops to see him and say, am I a friend of informers? Am I going to speak to people who have just done that? Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi answered, I only did what the law permits me to do. And the answer is, who tells you that this is what you need to do? Okay, the law tells you this is what you need to do, but there are situations where this is not what you're supposed to do. You have to go what's called lifnim mishurat hadin, beyond the requirement of the law, or in another Talmudic terminology, pe'amim, there are times shebitula shel Torah zo yosada, where the transgression of the law is its essence. There are times where the transgression of the law is the keeping of the essence of the law. A difficult concept, a dangerous concept, because it can lead to cancellation of the law. The problem is there are times. That's the responsibility of the individual. When is that time? And of course, we can get it wrong. Okay, so there was this halachic take here on also how to read those passages. And then if you remember, last we saw the text of Levinas. Levinas, who was kind of building up on what we had said, or at least that's how I presented it. And he was pointing to a phrase that I'm rereading here. Can a doctrine, and he's talking about the harshness of the God of the Old Testament, according to Simon Weil, okay? Can a doctrine that is not a doctrine of kindness be a school of kindness? Is it possible that the Jewish biblical doctrine of a God that appears to be harsh, demanding, vengeful, sometimes mandating violence, so it's not a doctrine of kindness, can this text become a school of kindness? And what he was saying is, this is the function of the oral law. This is what the oral law has done. This is what he called the Lernen had done. okay, this ability of the rabbinic tradition to learn from the text, to study the text, to open up the text has done. And what we said about that, I'm not going back to the whole argument, but what we said about that was that the question we might ask ourselves today is, have we lost this ability within the Jewish tradition? Have we lost this ability to be able to battle out the written word in order to really engage in the oral tradition and be able to do that? So this is a question that is a painful question. I was asking the question in light of the Torah HaMelech, if you remember, the Torah of the King, this terrible book that I mentioned. On the other side, there was a bit of an element of criticism of Christianity, a polemical element, which of course comes in the Levinas story with Simon Weil, where he was also pointing out to the opposite danger of Christianity, the danger of a possible infinite compassion. Is not infinite compassion opening the risks for the love of evil? Okay, and he was pointing out in an interesting way that while we should be worried about maybe the danger of some elements in the rabbinic and the Jewish tradition, or at least maybe in what we've lost, there's also maybe something in the Christian tradition that needs to be looked at carefully, and he was saying that with humility. So then we moved, if you remember, to the second part of the topic of the seminar, which was starting again from Jan Assmann in the introductory reading about the Mosaic exception, of saying the Mosaic exception of the biblical monotheism that mandates violence because it says no other God but me, and everybody else who is in a kind of other God should be slaughtered. Okay, how do we reconcile that, if it can be reconciled, with the question of religious freedom, which is a concept that we cherish? Maybe necessarily not all the way through, but certainly we have a certain value that we attach to religious freedom. So that would include, of course, the freedom of unbelief. It's not just the freedom of different practice, but the freedom of unbelief. And are the two really in total confrontation, or is there a way we can reconcile the two? So what I did to start with, if you remember, is we looked at two quotes that I wanted to contrast. The first one was Exodus 20, which again was this presentation of a very harsh God. You should have no other God but me. But if you do, even up to the third and fourth generation, you're going to be punished, and so on and so forth. And I contrasted that with the text from the prophet Micha, okay, who ended up saying, at the end of the day, in the Messianic time, everyone will worship its own God. That's what is written. And everyone will sit under its vine tree and will be happy ever after. Okay, and the question was, is Micha a correction of Exodus? Is it a prophetic way to correct the harshness of the Exodus narrative, in the same way as the book of Ezekiel corrects also the book of Exodus on children will not be punished for the sins of the father, while the text of Exodus says the opposite? Or are we here dealing with not so much a correction, but simply a tension between the real life and Messianic life? So what I said about this, which will bring us to where we were, was that the problem with the book of Micha, of course, is it is pitched as a Messianic text, but we live in the present, right? And if we live in the present, we do have to find a way to deal with the question of religious freedom in the present and not just in a Messianic expectation. So from that point of view, I used the quote of Micha to contrast it with the Exodus quote, but not necessarily to find an entry point into where is it that religious tradition can find a way to value, not to accept, to value religious freedom. And the one I suggested, I'm going to put it back here, but you will for sure remember it, was the text of, make it a bit bigger, the text of Isaiah. I was interested in the text of Isaiah. This one here, if I can make it a bit bigger, it would be great. Indeed, okay, verse 15, Achen ata el mistater, indeed, you are a God who hides himself, O God of Israel, the Savior. And this seems to me to be a promising verse because a hiding God leaves room and more room for human practices than a God who is ever overtly present. When God is overtly present, you ask God what to do. The Urim in the text of the Bible, before you go to war, okay, so you ask God for and God answers, okay. When Moses has a problem, he goes to God and God answers, so you have the answer. But in a God that is mistater, who is in hiding, who is not so obviously present, which is, for most of us, the experience of a religious life, okay, an absent God, a more secretive, more hidden God, also has the potential to open for something else. And this is what I wanted to illustrate. And if you remember, we don't need, I'll keep it here, but you remember the story that I told you about, which was the Talmudic story, the first anchor with an halachic perception, the oven of Achnai, okay? So I summed up the story, and I'll do it again. It's, about the argument whether this oven is kosher or not kosher for Pesach or not for Pesach, and the miracles that happen. Rabbi Eliezer, who keeps asking for the miracle, he asks for God to intervene with the river that goes back, with the tree that is uprooted, the walls of the city, you'll remember that. And where we stopped was to the point that I think is of most interest now, is what comes at the end. When Rabbi Natan, so is that clear as a summary? Is that okay? Yeah. So when Rabbi Natan came across the prophet Elijah, so some time has passed, if you want, he said, tell me, what was God doing while all this discussion was happening? Okay? And we have to understand the phrase. What does it imply when we say, what was God doing while all this was happening in the house of study between Rabbi Yoshua and the sages and Rabbi Eliezer? What does the phrase implies?
Who was correct?
Okay, so it can happen it can mean, what was God thinking, or on what side would he have gone? Okay, but you're reading in the text more than what is written. What is written is, what was God doing while all this was happening? What do you make of what was God doing? So either a reproach of saying, why were you not so more involved? But in fact, God to a certain degree was involved because the miracles took place. Remember the tree, the river, and so on. But it also implies that God was doing something else. That somehow, and that's the El Mistater, that is the hiding God. That somehow there is a space in which God, whatever his business is okay, he's doing his business, and the rabbinic discussion is human business, okay? So the question actually points us back to the issue of Ezekiel, the issue of Isaiah, okay, of a God who somehow has distanced itself. If you want to use Martin Buber terminology, you would say, the eclipse of God is a kind of a more removed, more hidden, okay? So what was God doing during that time? And the answer is, the prophet replied, God smiled and said, my children have defeated me, okay? Now, the important thing here is, what if we understand this as, there is indeed no other God than you. Who is another God who wants to be defeated? Who is another God who has given the responsibility and the freedom to his people, to his children, to actually have their own disagreement, to battle it out? And remember the passage before, Rabbi Joshua stood firm, when the miracle kind of happened, Rabbi Joshua stood firm and proclaimed, the Torah is not in heaven, so we would not listen to the voice of God. We don't have to listen to the voice of God to decide what happens with the oven. In other words, you have here, in this kind of hiddenness, remoteness, subtle remoteness of God, you have, from a legal perspective, you have a possibility of a certain plurality of approach, at least in the way the debate is taking place. So what I'm saying with this is that this, to me, really points to an halachic entry point. And I'm not saying that you have to go all the way. I'm careful with the words. You don't go all the way to say, well, suddenly the rabbinic tradition embraces pluralism. It's not true. It's not as clear as that and embraces religious freedom. There's nothing more problematic than this notion of religious freedom in the rabbinic tradition too. But if you are looking for an entry point, this provides an interesting narrative as a possible entry point with all the restriction you have. Now, look at what happens after. There's a little bit of an end to the story. The day they reversed all of Rabbi Eliezer's decision, okay, which he had declared his views on matters of ritual purity and impurity. So you see what happened here. You have a discussion about the oven. And suddenly they say, so at the end of the day, Rabbi Yoshua wins the ruling because the majority of the people follow him. And okay, he said, Torah is not in heaven, let us debate. And if we decided that Rabbi Eliezer is wrong, he's wrong. But suddenly it becomes totalitarian. They have reversed everything that Rabbi Eliezer has said. I thought we were talking about the oven, okay? But suddenly everything is reversed. On everything he has taught, his views on matters on ritual purity and impurity, and they decided that because he refused to accept the majority decision, that he should be excommunicated. So while the narrative is about the possibility of a God who accepts to be defeated, the rabbis don't like it, okay? They make a general case, a vendetta against Rabbi Eliezer, and they throw him out of the community, so he is excommunicated because he has not accepted the view of the majority. Now, of course, what's crucial here, and we'll see that in a minute, is that the operative factor in terms of deciding the law is not the truth anymore. It's the majority view, which is, one would say, democracy, in very modern term and with a lot of shortcuts. At the same time, it's very problematic. Since when the majority is reasonable? Let alone right, just reasonable. Okay? So we have to be careful with that. But they then suddenly turn, interestingly, they say, but who will inform him? We've decided that without him. Okay? Who will inform him, they ask. Now, Rabbi Akiva, who's the most well-known, if you want, rabbi in the Talmudic literature, feared in case someone unworthy without tact would go to Eliezer and cause Eliezer anger enough to curse the world, so he himself volunteered. He said, listen, this is a touchy subject, okay? I don't want someone rude, someone unprepared to go and speak to Rabbi Eliezer, because Rabbi Eliezer, even though he might have been wrong in not following the majority, he has extraordinary power. He has a relationship with God, and if he wants to curse the world, he will curse the world. So let me go, okay? Suddenly, it becomes very human again. There's this tension, right, between this kind of religious freedom that you read in the text that somehow is completely negated, and somehow that becomes very personal. Listen, I need to speak to him one-to-one. This is not just a matter of he's excommunicated and who cares. He wrapped himself in black cloak as a sign of mourning, okay, and went to Rabbi Eliezer, standing some distance apart. I guess he just wants to be careful of the potential curse that's going to happen. And he said in a casual way, "What's new? What's new, Akiba? How's your day been?" And asked Eliezer, and Akiba answered. He said, "It seems as if your colleagues have left you." So he doesn't say you've been excommunicated. It seems that your colleagues have left you. Then he rent his black cloth, removed his shoes, and sat on the ground, and Rabbi Eliezer wept. They said that during that year, the harvests were badly affected by a reduction of 1/3 in olives, wheat, and barley. Some said that even the dough, in the hands of women was spoiled, and the biggest disaster was that everything Eliezer started out turned out into ashes. He had this kind of gaze where everything he would look, everything he would look would turn into ashes. The price of the refusal of the plurality for the benefit of a communality, which is not something we should disregard, there is a tension of religious freedom, and how do we keep a cohesive religious tradition? Okay, but the price here is everything is destroyed. Everything could be destroyed. So there's something very serious here that's taking place. And then he says, sometimes afterward, Rabban Gamliel, the president of the court, was traveling by boat when a fierce storm across threatening the vessel and its passengers. Rabban Gamliel said, this must be on account of the tragedy of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hirkanos, the same one as the one we read about. So he went on the deck and proclaimed, Master of the universe, I acknowledge that I sanctioned the excommunication of Rabbi Eliezer. But you know that I did that not for my honor, not for the honor of my father's house, but only to prevent disputation in the house of Israel. And at last the storm abated. So the last part here of the text is about this kind of way to try to see how we amend and what is the operative factor. There is a possibility of a certain form of pluralism. The pluralism puts into the picture the question of the unity of the community. The question of the unity of the community can become very quickly an argument for a radical, monolithic kind of thought. Everything that Rabbi Eliezer said is going to be destroyed. In return, the one who is put on the margin of that religious society also has the potential to destroy the community. And what is interesting is that this is not about truth here. Okay, this question about the plurality of approach, again, that I'm pitching against the Exodus text to start with, is not about truth. It's about how do you keep a community together? How far can you go? How much can you stretch that difference? Okay, and I think from that point of view, the story here has something to teach us, not so much about where to put the cursor, but something simply about pointing to the different elements that are part of that puzzle. Okay. Is that okay for everyone with this story? Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that story to jump to 4 texts, contemporary texts, 2 from the Jewish tradition and 2 from the Christian non-Catholic tradition. Okay, and I think you hopefully you will find it you will find that interesting. Let me just go back to my notes here. So the first one is a kind of a more theological approach to that same problem of a hiding God that permits or does not permit an entry point into pluralism, okay, which is what I think somehow this story is also about. So this I don't need, and I'm going to speak about a text from a rabbi called Rabbi Erwin Greenberg. This, I think, is a text from 1982. Rabbi Greenberg, still alive, he's fairly elderly. He's maybe the key voice in North American Orthodox Judaism. Modern Orthodox, okay, he's kind of the modern Orthodoxy. But Rabbi Greenberg is a very, very well-known voice, very active in Jewish-Christian dialogue, very active in the life of the Jewish community. He's really an important voice. And he has written a text which is, hold on, where is it? Oh, yeah, here. Which is about, in 3 parts, the 3rd great cycle of Jewish history, voluntary covenant, and the 3rd era of Jewish history, power and politics. So it's all very contemporary and it has important effects. So let me first maybe just say a few words about the context of what Greenberg is saying. The argument, so it's a text about covenant theology. What is this covenant that I talked about? He says, if you look at the biblical text, the metaphor for the covenant is master-slave, always, okay? And the master-slave relationship, in terms of gesture, is really a relationship like this, so the master said, the slave does, and that's the nature of the relationship. The slave has an obligation to obey, the master has an obligation to protect. What happens when, in Jewish history, protection fails? So protection doesn't happen. So you can either say it's because the slave didn't perform, okay, or you can say maybe there's a problem with the master, okay. So what he does, he's looking at different tragedies in Jewish history, and in particular, the tragedy of the destruction of the first temple and the tragedy of the destruction of the second temple. Okay, so those are about 500 years apart, and more or less. And he says, what happened with the metaphor of master-slave after the first tragedy? He said, after the first destruction, you don't find anymore, to evoke that destruction in rabbinic literature, you do not find anymore the question of master-slave. That was biblical. But in this later period, after the destruction, what you find is teacher-student. God as the master pedagogue, as he called, and the Jewish people as a student. So he said, it's still an hierarchy, but it's not like this. It's an hierarchy like this, and somehow God still kind of dictates, but the relationship that God has with the Jewish people is that of a teacher and its student, and it's a kind of a softer approach. And then he goes on and he says, after the second destruction, where theologically there was an understanding that maybe we are dealing with a God that is a little bit more removed from history, and this is why maybe the destruction took place. So what the rabbis do is they reject the theology of the prophets who have always said it's not at all that God is removed. On the opposite, it's a very present God who punishes you. But he says the rabbi don't always take that view. They said there are many occasions when it's not about us being punished. It's about somehow we're dealing with a God who is not so involved in history. And he says the metaphor is not anymore about teacher and student, but it's the metaphor that you find in the acceptance of the Song of Songs in the canon, so what we were talking about earlier, which is husband and wife. So he said husband and wife is a metaphor in which the two partners tread on equal ground. Okay? He said that's what you find after the destruction of the temple, of the second temple in the kind of overall rabbinic text. His argument is, what happened with the third destruction? Which is what? The Shoah, Auschwitz. What happens after Auschwitz? He said the covenant has a problem because here Jews were killed because they were Jews, and the image he uses, which he takes from Elie Wiesel and other writers, is that this becomes, being Jewish becomes, as he calls it, a suicide mission. And he said, when you live in an age where being Jewish becomes a suicide mission, nobody can tell you by a command that you should be part of that covenant. And so he's moved the covenant, and that's why he calls it the voluntary covenant, of saying we've moved from there, to there, to there, and to there. He said, now, we are Jews not because we are commanded to be Jews, but we are Jews because we want to be Jews, despite everything, and therefore we are the kind of senior partner. So he has inverted, if you want, the dynamic of the covenant. Now, what's interesting with this is not so much, I needed to do that so that you understand the text that's coming up, but I'm now relating it back, if you want, to the topic that is ours, which is what does a covenant that exists, whatever shape it takes, with a God that is so hidden that you become the senior partner in the covenant, what does that mean in terms of pluralism? What is the consequence? Now, he talks, among other things, about the story we've read about the oven of Achnai, and he, of course, makes the point of, while in the Bible God is overtly present and always tells you what's the right answer to all of your problems, in the rabbinic literature, when there is an awareness of the hiddenness of God, that's why you have a plurality of rabbinic voices. You have Rabbi Hillel against Rabbi Shammai, the school of Hillel against Shammai, you have Rav against Shmuel, you have always rabbis debating with each other. He said this is only possible because in the time where God is more hidden, the truth is more hidden. So of course you have disputation in the text. So he relates it to that. Now, where we're going to read is what comes after. And I'm going to read just a few passages. I'll just make it a bit bigger so you can follow with me. I don't know, my fingers are not working. Oh, yeah, here. Okay, so he gives a little bit of historical context, which is what I've said. The total assault on Judaism and on the Jewish people was an attempt to stamp out the covenant, the witness, and ultimately the presence of God, who is the ground of life and covenantal hope. Therefore, the very existence of the Jewish people is a fundamental statement that the covenant is ongoing. The survival of the Jewish people in a world full of enemies, where the model of the Holocaust is circulating, is in itself testimony to the existence of a hidden God whose awesome, if invisible force, is evidence of an ongoing life of the Jewish people. Okay, so he's recasting the debate into what I kind of tried to express a little bit earlier. Now, I'm skipping a little bit. I'm reading at the end and move to the next page. He said, in that reality, it makes no difference, no essential difference, if the Jews involve consciously articulate the covenantal hope or express a belief in the God who is the ground of that covenant. It makes no difference in that reality where the presence of God is manifested by the survival of the people. Okay? It makes no difference whether you express belief or adhesion with the commandment explicitly stated in that covenant. What he's trying to say is, as long as you continue to live as a Jew, as long as you continue to have Jewish children, as long as you continue to be a Jew, whatever form, you are living the covenant. You are not living the covenant in the way the Bible understood it. You are not living the covenant in the way the rabbis understood it. But remember, I used once the expression, do we live in a post-rabbinic world? Okay? After the Shoah, after Auschwitz, do we live in a post-rabbinic world? In other words, is the model that the rabbi understood as going up to there, which therefore permits a certain plurality within the limit of the cohesiveness of the community, is that not overtaken by Auschwitz, because of Auschwitz, in the sense that if it is a voluntary covenant, the mandate to follow the commandments has no validity because it's voluntary. So I follow the commandments if I want. No God can tell me what to follow if it's to bring this suicide mission that he talks about in another part of the text. Okay, so he's trying to articulate this view. He's getting a little bit more explicit in what comes after, I hope. So I read here, the witness is given, so the witness to the covenant is given by their action. Action speaks louder than words. People who profess God but gas men, women and children, or burn them alive, are atheists, whatever their words may be. The belonging of the words does not mean anything anymore. Okay? People who profess to be atheists or to be without hope, yet who actively uphold the covenant, even at the cost of their lives, betray their true position by their action. If anything, their denial only adds to the hiddenness of the divine. Okay? It's their verbal objection, if you want, refusal, only adds to the hiddenness, but their action speaks by themselves. I don't need the words here anymore, okay? Therefore, the theological language is the appropriate one for this time, more appropriate than those who go on speaking as if God were visible and fully performing under the previous terms of the covenant. And here he's having a dig at the people who would use today, in the Jewish community or outside of the Jewish community, who would use prophetic writings to say, all catastrophes are always because of your sins, because that's what the prophets were saying, and say, those who say, I hold to the covenant, and therefore I'm looking at the Shoah, and I said, the Shoah is because of our sins, or because of your sins, or the sins of that generations. He said, those ones profess the words of the covenant, but they do not live the covenant. They don't live the covenant because they haven't understood the dynamic of the covenant that has always existed from biblical time to the first destruction to the second destruction and so on and so forth. So he's saying you have to be really extremely careful. Now, what does that mean? That means that, of course, those who continue to profess the covenant still remain part of the Jewish community. Okay? But it also means that those who don't profess that image of the covenant are also part of the community because their actions testify for them. If they continue to live as Jews, whatever that means, whatever content I put in that phrase, it is a covenantal reality. And here you have a theological serious opening in which the promise of pluralism and the way you enter the covenant becomes very real, and it becomes part of what we know. Now, I just read the next passage here in this new era on the second column here, if you have it. In this new era, so I'm going a little bit quickly on this, but the voluntary covenant is the theological base of genuine pluralism. Pluralism is not a matter of tolerance made necessary by living in a non-Jewish reality, nor is it pity for one who does not know any better. It's not, you're practicing a bit of an odd kind of Judaism, but you know what, I forgive you because you know no better. No, there is something that in a voluntary covenant, if the covenant has moved in the way he's tried to explain, and I attempted to summarize, if that covenant has moved to a voluntary stage, pluralism is rooted in the covenant. It was not, and you see the path that we followed from the time of the biblical narrative of Exodus, there is no other God but me, and so on and so forth, to the time of saying, well, I actually don't really know what that means anymore, because in the voluntary nature of the covenant, this is what I'm entitled to do. It is a recognition that all Jews have chosen to make the fundamental Jewish statement at great personal risk and cost. The present denominations are part for the covenant-minded, all leading towards the final goal. The controversy between them will not be whether God has commanded this way. Conservative Jews, Reform Jews, liberal Jews, secular Jews can freely concede the dimension of past commandment, but insist nevertheless that these are no longer effective or optimal way of achieving those goals. Orthodox Jews, even ultra-right, who hold every past observance or custom, will recognize that their commitment to observe the entire tradition constitute a voluntary acceptance, one which can be modeled but cannot be demanded or mandated of all. Thus, they can be faithful to the full authority of halakha, which is the Jewish law, accepting the challenge of modeling it and making it credible and persuasive to the whole community of Israel. So suddenly here's an Orthodox thinker, okay, who is saying the change in the nature of the covenant, which is the result of a God that has become more and more hidden, hence the relationship to the quote of Isaiah, translate immediately into not just the opening entry point into pluralism that we saw with the story of the oven of Achnai in the Talmudic text, but in something that is much more structured. Okay, and here it says, yeah, if we live in this time, freedom of religious practice within Judaism, he's talking here within Judaism, is part of the covenantal reality. It is not in the margin anymore. Okay, it's not in the margin. It's not a question of the majority opinion anymore. If you don't accept that, you haven't understood in which moment of Jewish history we live. And that's why he calls the book here the third great cycle of Jewish history. We live in the third cycle of Jewish history, and there is this fundamental shift in which there is an offside to the question of plurality, okay, and pluralism. So the next text I want to read, if it's okay with you, you have maybe any question on this, or? No? That's okay? Right. So the next text I want to read is also from another Orthodox scholar that I like very much, Eliezer Berkowitz. Eliezer Berkowitz is an Australian, no, I'm saying something silly. He's a German rabbi, Orthodox rabbi. He died 1988, I think. He came from Germany, he went to England, he went to the United States, and then he worked in Australia at the end of his life. I think he's quite a well-known figure in Israel because he's worked on very important legal issues that pertain to the reality of the state. But what I'm interested here is the text that is, let me just get it right here, that is going to start on page 69. And he too relate this kind of sense of plurality and religious freedom, and you will see this will be including the right of unbelief to the question of the catastrophe, the Shoah, Auschwitz. Okay. What will become interesting is that it is the question of the catastrophe and the death that permits a real point of entry into religious freedom when understood in certain theological terms. So he's dealing in a book which is called Faith After the Holocaust, and he's doing the following. I'm starting on the question at the top. The question of God's providence in the death camp was taking place within the classical tradition of Judaism. Unfortunately, unlike the case of Job, the book of Job, God remained silent at the very end of the tragedy, and the millions in the concentration camps were left alone to shift for themselves in the midst of infinite despair. To this day, theologians are arguing about the meaning of God's answers to Job. And he goes on, he explains a little bit. He's relating the question of the Holocaust to the question of Job, which is something that many people have done, but suddenly he's going to take a turn that is way more interesting and which opens to this question of religious freedom, as you'll see in a minute. So I'm picking it up here where they were really, right here. They were really, is that big enough for reading? Can do it maybe a bit better. Yeah, I can do, but can't. Okay. They were, where is it? Yeah, they were really, in fact, two Jobs at Auschwitz. He said, if you compare Auschwitz to the book of Job, there is many problems. The first one is that Job survived, and in Auschwitz, Job didn't survive. The other problem is Job is a very universal figure. Job is not a Jew. He might be a Jew, but he's not presented as a Jew in the book of Job. The Holocaust, the Shoah, from that point of view, because it was an assault on Judaism, to take a universal figure is in itself a little bit problematic because it's too universal to do justice to the history. But his point is a bit different here, he said. So there were two Jobs at Auschwitz. The one who belatedly accepted the advice of Job's wife and turned his back on God, meaning what did this one do? He took, lately maybe, but he took the advice of Job's wife, doing rebellion. Reject that nonsense of a God. This is what you read in the advice of the wife, okay? The Jew who lost faith, that's why I said now it turns to unbelief. The one says, there's nothing, this makes no sense, okay? So there was this kind of Job in Auschwitz. He turned his back on God, and there was also the other who kept his faith to the very end. He went to the gas chamber with his faith intact, okay? The one to the end who affirmed it at the very door of the gas chamber, who were able to walk in his death defiantly singing, Anima Amin, I believe in the coming of the Messiah, even though he tarries. That's a phrase of Maimonides. If there were those whose faith was broken in the death camps, there were others who never wavered. We have therefore two types of people, okay? If God was not present for many, he was not lost for many more. Those who rejected did so in authentic rebellion. religious rebellion becomes authentic faith. Okay? And those who affirm and testify to the very end also did so in authentic faith. Neither the authenticity of rebellion nor the authenticity of faith is available to those who are only Job's brother, us. I wasn't there. I am not Job. I am Job's brother. But as Job's brother, I have an obligation to be faithful to the two Jobs. The one who rebelled and lost his faith, the unbeliever. He might have been a believer, but he became an unbeliever. And his unbelief, his rebellion is authentic. And I have to respect that. Simultaneously, I have to respect those who entered with faith and ended with faith. Their faith was authentic too. And I have, as a contemporary Jew, and now you can extrapolate a little bit, not just within Judaism, I have to be faithful, not just respectful, faithful to the reality of this world in which belief and unbelief are both authentic. Okay, so here it's becoming a really interesting point about expanding this kind of question of religious freedom to really something that's way bigger. The outsider, the brother of the martyrs, enter a confusing heritage. That's who we are. He inherits both the rebellion and the witness of the martyrs. A rebellion not silenced by the witness, a witness not made void by the rebellion. And he has this wonderful phrase, in our generation, Job's brothers, us, if he wishes to be true to his God-given heritage, reason with God in believing rebellion and rebellious belief. We have to be faithful to both, okay? The believing rebellion and the religious belief. The rebellious, belief. And here you have, if you want to be inscribed in a contemporary religious tradition that makes sense after the historical reality of the Jewish people, the first destruction, the second destruction, whatever followed after, and ultimately the Shoah, then you have to be faithful to belief and to unbelief, and you have to live with both. You can't make a radical choice of saying, this is what Judaism is. This is what the religious tradition is. It has to be a religion of belief, or it has to be a religion of unbelief. I need to find space within me. He said, that's the problem. I have to face space within me to be at the same time rebellious and believer. But I can't exclude one or the other, because if I do that, I negate half of those who perished, who were murdered. And I will not do that. I will respect those who were there because I'm only Job's brother. I am not Job, so I have a duty to respect what was authentic in their time. And in order to do that, what has to be authentic in my time is to find a way to be both rebellious and believer at the same time. And I think that becomes a very interesting point, again, very far away from the radical reading of Exodus through Jan Assmann and the Mosaic exception, in which at the end of the day you have no other choice, and it's either that or you disappear. What is then that he may hope for? He's not searching for understanding in terms of his faith or what has fallen his people. He's not attempting to steal a glance at the hand of the Almighty, I think he says, at the hand of the Almighty, in order to be able to appreciate what meaning the senseless destruction of European Israel might have in the divine scheme. If you want to do that, don't try to search for answer. In front of the tragedy, don't try to search for answer. If you try to search for answer, you're going to end up either in the unbelief or in the radical belief. But either way, you are not authentic because you're negating the other half. Okay? To understand is to justify, to accept, and that he will not do. He looks at his religious bearings, he desires to affirm, but not by behaving as if the Holocaust had never happened. He knows what his generation must live and believe in the shadow of the Holocaust. He must learn how this is to be done. His faith, if his faith is to remain meaningful, he must make room for the impenetrable darkness of the death camp with his faith. And this is where the hidden God takes a dramatic turn. The hidden God of Isaiah is a necessary point of entry that allows, in a dramatic shape here, for the impenetrable darkness of our generation and our historical experience. And it is out of this impenetrable darkness that somehow there is, in a surprising way, in an unexpected way, there is something of a coexistence of the variety of belief, unbelief, and unbelief can kind of coexist together. So I thought that was kind of an interesting take to look at that. Now, what does that make you think about if you shift to the Christian side of the equation? If you were to try to translate that into Christian theological dogmas, I would say, where would you search eventually? Any guess? Okay, so I'll do that with a lot of humility because this is not my field, okay? But I'm very fortunate when I teach in Rome that I have, just like I had this morning with you, wonderful time with the students of mine who are all priests and so on. And they always teach me and come and say, oh, that makes me think of this in my, in the Catholic tradition and so on and so forth. And I was pointed out to two texts, which they're not Catholic texts, but they're from the Protestant tradition. One from Karl Barth and the other one from Moltmann. And I just want to read to you, and again, I do that with humility because those texts are really difficult. I think they're difficult for people who know, and they're difficult for people like me who pretend to know those things but don't really know. But I want to read it because it strikes me as an equivalent sort of entry point in the Christian dimension of that equation, in which suddenly belief and unbelief coincide. Very similar, I think, to what Eliezer Berkowitz was saying. So, yes, please, Véronique. Yes. Yes, so there is too. I mean, of course, the notion of the hidden God in Isaiah has to be present to a certain degree in the Christian tradition. I think what I mentioned yesterday was that while, of course, the text does exist, this absent God, the theology of incarnation and of a God who saves makes it more problematic to face a God that does not save, who's not so present suddenly. Okay, so I think there are people who've pointed out to that the incarnation, if we relate it to what Rubinstein has saying, is an attempt at the re-enchantment of the world. But at the same time, does it not, and I put that as a question, does it not make it more difficult to understand what Isaiah wants to say? And Isaiah has this interesting phrase, the El Mistater Moshiach, the hidden God, the Savior. How is the hidden God saved if he's not present? And the incarnation here maybe adds a level of, the verse is already difficult, but maybe it adds a level of difficulty. But here, Karl Barth, okay, and this is a text it's taken from the Credo, okay, he takes the Credo, and here's where we begin our consideration of the doctrine of the death of Jesus Christ with a glance at the humblest part of our symbol. And I mean the word sepultus, okay, the sepulture. So again, don't hesitate to, you'll surely have your reading of the text. And again, as I said, I do that because I think the text is fascinating, but it is certainly not the field that I'm competent with. This truth that is in itself so trivial, so insignificant, so little likely to give any information, the truth that Jesus Christ was buried was to Paul, as to be learned from 1 Corinthians, a matter of moment. Strange to say, he perceived in it the reality of what is met with baptism, that we are buried with Christ. And he quotes here the two citation. First of all, the mention of the symbol of the burial of Jesus Christ has evidently a function quite similar to the previous mention of Pontius Pilate. It is another reminder of the true humanity of Christ. It is a more fundamental and comprehensive reminder than that of the sub Pontio Pilato, that I think is part of the Credo. To say that he was buried is the most unambiguous way in which it is possible to stamp a being as a true actual man. An angel or an idea or the essence of Christianity obviously cannot be buried. But Jesus Christ was buried. So, and this is the remarkable thing here, there is a point, namely this point in the Credo, where the word of the believer completely coincides with the word of the unbeliever. That somehow, when you talk about the sepultus, there is a moment of junction between the believer and the unbeliever. And somehow, my question, I mean, as he says, I mean, I just read just a little more. He says, sepultus is something that beside the Church Father and Luther and Calvin, also Celsus and Voltaire and others could have said. Surely, what they were saying on the two sides of the equation would have been quite different things, but they had to use the same word. You know, either you negate or you affirm, you still have to use the same word. And he said, by the very fact that you use the same word, you do create a point of junction between the believer and the unbeliever. And it seems to me, I don't need to read more, but it seems to me that there is here something that is not so dissimilar to what Berkowitz was saying in his own term, which I'm wondering to what extent that, I suppose, moment of darkness, which I know is overcome, okay, in the Easter period, is overcome by resurrection, clearly. But nevertheless, there is that moment of darkness. And just like Berkowitz uses the image of this darkness to be able to say it is in the midst of that darkness, when you want to do justice to that darkness, that belief and unbelief can meet, then here too. And I think it's kind of important to just shed the light to see that point of contact here, that might be an entry point into an acceptance, despite of you should have no other God but me, that seems to mandate absolute immediate belief and there's no room for anything else, that here somehow there is something else that's open. There's another door that's open. And I'm not doing the last text, but the last text is very difficult, but I think it's from the text of the Reformed theologian Moltmann. The crucified God makes something that is not dissimilar, a point that is not dissimilar. Okay, so is that okay with this? Just to wrap up. Okay, now we don't have a lot of time, but I still want to tackle the third subject, if you want, of today. Let me just give me 1 second so I can take it on my computer here. Yeah, and I will also now change this and put what is right. So let me first introduce the third topic. The third topic is also about violence, but in a different context, which is the question of the holiness of the land. Okay, now the question of the holiness of the land is obviously a political topic to a certain degree, or to a large degree. It's a rough topic. It's a dangerous topic. And we have to be really careful when we tread on that issue. I just want to give you a little bit of context to this. The Holy Land is a terminology that exists for a long time. It's the terminology that is now favored by the Church, the Catholic Church, to talk about Israel. The Catholic Church today, officially, the Vatican documents, since last year, do not use the term Israel. Okay. It came a bit as a surprise because at the end of the day, Israel exists. Okay. But despite all the complexity and the tensions and everything that you want to talk about in the current conflict, the Church has made the choice to remove the term Israel and to talk about the Holy Land. So in November last year, I together with 4 friends of mine who were also rabbinic scholars and Jewish scholars involved with Jewish-Christian dialogue, we wrote an open letter to the Pope that was published in the newspaper, and the Pope answered a few months later. And we asked the Pope just to be careful with the kind of words that he was using. So the letter was circulating and signed by, I think, 500 Jewish scholars who deal with Jewish-Christian dialogue. And the answer of the Pope was extremely nice, was extremely friendly, but the word Israel didn't appear, not once. And since then, it has become the norm that it talks about the Holy Land. Now, the way to talk about the Holy Land, because you don't want to mention the name Israel, has problem of its own. Apart from a negation of reality, even if you disagree with that reality, it's still a reality. Because the holiness of the land, and this is what I want to concentrate on, has its own violence, in the sense that holiness creates violence, and has always. So to talk about the holiness of the land, in order not to fall and to express to talk about a political entity because you're afraid of the violence that is associated with it, but you shift it with another word which is also conveyor of violence, is not necessarily so simple. I'm not sure what other terminology there are, but nevertheless, it's a little bit of a complicated issue. So what I would like to try to do is to start with a short reflection on the question of language. What language do we talk? And when we speak about the Holy Land, what language do we use? And is there, if the biblical text is a conveyor of violence in the sense that the holiness could appear to mandate to me a possession at all cost, let's put it this way, which then would generate, obviously, violence, is there nevertheless, in the biblical text or in the rabbinic thinking, is there nevertheless another way to try to think about a more peaceful sort of language? Is there another language that can be used? So that's what I would like to try to look at. The first text I suggest we look at is, let me just, here it's Seminar 3. Hold on. Seminar 1. Where's Seminar 3? Seminar 2. Seminar 1. Hold on. Oh, here. Right. It's a text by Gershom Scholem. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with Gershom Scholem. Yeah. So the great Israeli professor at the time who really developed the study of Kabbalah and mysticism and worked a lot on language as well. And he has this extraordinary text. It starts like this. He talks about language and the state of Israel. I don't know. This country is a volcano, and we know. And language is lodged within it. And this is interesting. Christianity is the religion of the Logos, and certainly the question of language is of primary importance. People here talk of many things that may lead to our ruin, and more than ever of the Arabs. It's a very different context than today. Huh? He's not talking about today, obviously. But there is another danger, much more uncanny than the Arab nations, and it is a necessary result of the Zionist enterprise. What of the actualization of the Hebrew language? The sacred language on which we nurture our children, is it not an abyss that must one day open up? The people certainly don't know what they are doing. They think that they have secularized the Hebrew language. They have done away with its apocalyptic expression. But that is not true. The secularization of the language is no more than a manner of speaking, a ready-made expression. It is impossible to empty the words so bursting with meaning unless one sacrifices the language itself. But if we transmit the language to our children as it was transmitted to us, if we, a generation of transition, revive the language of the ancient books for them, that it may reveal itself anew through them, shall not the religious power of that language explode one day? And when that explosion occurs, what kind of a generation will experience it? It's terrifying. There's no other word, it's terrifying. It's terrifying of intelligence. It's terrifying of prophetic vision. Okay? We have revived Hebrew. We are using biblical terminology. That's why I'm making the link of saying, you replaced Israel with the Holy Land, but this is biblical terminology. It's not in Hebrew, but it's the same thing, okay? The words are not empty, they are not secularized. And when you use those words, one day, the religious power of those words will explode. And the days happened. The days happened in the sense that either on all sides of the equation, if you keep talking about this holiness and this charged language, which is associated with history, with violence, with conquest, with killing, with whatever you want, with absolute, one day it explodes. So for me, this is really a fundamental way to tackle the question of how do we find some sort of other language? Is there some sort of other language? And maybe not biblical language, but maybe rabbinic language. To find other words, to try to talk about a more peaceful approach. And I'm not naive, okay? I mean, nobody's gonna, in our generation, nobody will do it. But to tackle the Middle East conflict, which has a component of religiosity for all parties involved, to tackle it by thinking, what terminology do I use, seems to me a safer way to approach and maybe a more efficient way at the end of the day to approach it. And this is what I want to try and do today. What kind of language do we use? So I don't know if you have any reaction on that text or anything you want to say, but if you have any question, please, of course, I'm happy to. So the first next stage, if you want, in this short reflection here, is that in front of such affirmation, either we give up and we say, okay, well, listen, there's just no hope, or as I said, we search for a sort of alternative. But when we search for alternative, we have to be careful, because language doesn't do it all. It can maybe explode everything, but getting the right word is not sufficient either. And I want to quote, and I'll put it on the board, Jeremiah 8:11. So I'm going back to this website that I told you about, Sefaria, and I'm going to go to Jeremiah, 8, and I said 8:11. And I hope I got the quote right. 10. Yeah. This one in the middle, okay? They offered healing of hand for the wounds of my poor people, saying, Shalom, shalom, ve'ein shalom. Peace, peace, but there's no peace. So, in a way, you have to be careful. Talking about peace doesn't bring peace, okay? Just because you say shalom and you bring peace, and you can put it in every language that you want, Omrim shalom, shalom, ve'ein shalom, it's not sufficient to just make declaration and say, oh, I call for peace among the people. Okay, that's fine, but this is just a slogan. And Jeremiah is very aware of the danger of the slogans. The words are important, the slogans are dangerous. They make you think that, this is it. I've done it, but it's not sufficient. So we have to be careful with that and try to see what else we can do. So we need to work somehow with this concept of holiness, because it's there in the text. It's there in the mind of the people. It's there in the hearts of the people who feel something for that land, which is a place of the current conflict that we know. And what I want to do is I want to use the thought of someone which is called Meyer of Dvinsk. So you have him here. It's in English here. So it's end of the middle 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. He's a mitnaged. He was from Latvia, and he was the rabbi of Dvinsk. And Meir Simcha Cohen of Dvinsk is a very important figure on two accounts. One, he was a very, very critical thinker, and you'll see the audacity of what he writes, which is absolutely astonishing. But he was also someone who, despite what you might think in looking at the picture that we have, I think that's the only picture we have of him, a very orthodox figure. Obviously, you can tell from the picture, that's why I wanted to put it. He was living in the city of Dvinsk, which was a mixed city. Jews and Christians were living together. He was extremely involved with Christians. And you're going to see why is that important in the reflection on language in a minute. So I just wanted to point that out. And this will lead me to start looking at his first text. So it's from a book called the Meshech Chochmah, and it's a commentary on Exodus 1932. And we're going to read it, and I would be interested to know what you make of this. The idea. So I'm reading it first once, and then let's see what you take. Okay. The idea is that the Torah and faith are the essential of the Jewish nation, and all the holiness. So he's talking about our topic, all the holiness that is in Eretz Israel, in the land of Israel, or in Jerusalem, etc., they are only details and corollaries of the Torah, and they are sanctified by the holiness of the Torah. Holiness of the land, holiness of Jerusalem, holiness of the temple, they are only details. They are only holy in the sense that they are sanctified by the one holiness we know, which is the holiness of the Torah. Therefore, there is no distinction for any issue in the Torah between the place and the time. That is all equal either in Eretz Israel, in the land of Israel, or outside of it, except for certain commandments that are dependent on the land. And similarly, it is identical for a person of exception, Moses, the man of God, and for the lowest of the law. There's no hierarchy between Moses and anyone. And Moses was only called by the Torah an agent of God. And the Torah is not dependent on him, since its essence is a necessity to all. For holiness, blessed be it, and Torah are one, and just as he is a necessity, so is the Torah and its existence, which is only dependent on the primal cause. Okay. Blessed be his name. And concerning the worshipping of idols, for which we go back to the religious violence that we know about, okay? Moses cried out like a crane. Did you imagine that there was in me some sort of holiness, independent from the observance of the commandment, so that in the absence of my presence, you made for yourself a calf? He's talking about the golden calf. Moses go up, they disappear. People are worried. They say, where is the leader? Where's the holiness? Okay, let's do another one. And Moses here said, do you think there was any holiness in me? Do you think that my presence was something about the holiness? My holiness is only in relationship with the Torah. My holiness is not in myself. I have nothing holy. Okay? Heaven forbid. I, Moses, I am a human, just like you. And the Torah is not dependent on me. And do not come to imagine, and this is the part that's important here, do not come to imagine that the temple and the tabernacle are holy in themselves. There is no holiness in the temple, okay? Heaven forbid. The Eternal One, blessed be his name, dwells among his children, and if they are, or if they behave like someone who transgressed the covenant, any holiness is removed from them, and they are like a vulgar, profane tool. Just as the civilians came and profaned it, that's the Roman, and Titus came into the Holy of Holies with a prostitute, and yet was not ejected with force, for it's the temple holiness was removed. And even more than this, the tablets of stones of Mount Sinai, the tablets of stones written by God, are also not holy in themselves, but only in that they are holy for you. When the bride prostitutes itself under the wedding canopy, the chuppah, they are considered as no more than dejected common earthware, and they have no holiness in themselves, but only in that you keep them for yourselves. When all is said and done, there is nothing holy in the world. There is nothing holy in the world that is not related to worship and submission. So he's talking about the Torah. He's obviously not taking the view of what we saw with Greenberg and so on, not clearly, but okay. All holiness is in the command that the Creator commanded to build the tabernacle to perform in its sacrifices to the name, may it be blessed. That is the only holiness I know. The temple, the altar, the land, the tools, me. Holiness doesn't exist in itself. So to talk about the Holy Land is complicated because you kind of associate an existing holiness, an intrinsic holiness. And if you talk about an intrinsic holiness, what does that take away? For the individual. Holiness is in your relationship, your actions. So here we can relate it back to actually what Greenberg was saying, of saying, at the end of the day, it's not the declaration that they make. Their act speaks for themselves. Okay? Holiness, the holiness of the temple is because I do the temple because I was commanded to do the temple. But there's nothing holy in the temple. There's nothing holy in the tabernacle. And there's nothing holy even in the tablets of stones. There's nothing holy in the walls in Jerusalem. The wall in Jerusalem has nothing to do with holiness. So it's here, the first thing he does, he's working the concept of holiness. And he says, listen, you can talk about the Holy Land, but it depends what you mean. If you bring intrinsic holiness is going to remove your sense of responsibility, which is what he said here. There's nothing holy in this world that is not related to what I do, which is the worship and the submission to what God has commanded me, but it's not there in themselves. Okay?
He must be an exception.
He's an exception today, for sure. He's an exception today. He's very much loved by a part of the Jewish population that he would not associate with, which is, there's a whole part of the Jewish population who would say, yeah, actually, I agree with that. But within the religious circle, he was an exception. And we'll see what else he's done that is also quite exceptional. But what he's basing this on is an amazing statement at the very end of Deuteronomy. The very last passage in the book of Deuteronomy, the last verse, there's a commentary of Rashi, where Rashi, who's a medieval commentator, a French medieval commentator, which is kind of the reference point to a lot of rabbinic discourse, Rashi asked at the end, he said, what is the best thing that Moses did in his life? Now that the Torah is over, the Torah of Moses, what is the best thing that he did in his life? The best. The most remarkable, the only lasting thing that Moses did. What do you think? It's an open question, huh? I would only tell you that you're wrong according to Rashi. That's the worst that will happen, okay? He didn't enter the land, but is that a good thing? Could be. Okay, I see the. Yes, I see why you're mentioning that. Okay, that's an interesting one. Anyone else?
We don't know his tomb.
We don't know his tomb. Okay, so you can't worship Moses. Okay. Say that again.
He had a relation to, he was in relation with God on the mountain, but he stayed where he was.
Yes. Okay, so there is that element.
Follow the voice of God. When he received the call.
Okay, so obedience, if you want, here, yeah. Well, Rashi has a different take. Rashi says the best thing that he did was to break the tablets. He said, this is the best thing that break the tablet. And when God saw that Moses broke the tablet, he said, Yisher koach. Well done. That is what was needed. Because, as he said at the beginning here, if you think holiness is in me, and I disappear, you build a golden calf. I'm coming back down with my tablets. What is it that you're going to think? You're going to think God is in the tablet, okay? So if you think God is in the tablets have no purpose whatsoever. Let me smash the tablet. And God said, you know what? That is the best thing you've ever done. Yeah.
How hard is to deal with this idea that holiness doesn't exist? So in the world, for example, from a Christian point of view, God is in everything, in every place. But when people put in practice their faith, it's hard to say them that holiness is not outside.
It's very hard because it's very demanding. It's very, very demanding. Who among us wouldn't want or wouldn't like to think that we know where the holy is? We know how to even do it, or how to be part of it, or how to experience it. You know, there is a human need, I suppose, it provides a kind of compass, an island almost, a safety island, of saying, you know, I know the holy is here. So it is very demanding and it is very hard. The rabbinic tradition has had experience of the loss of the holy because we were expelled from the land after the Roman and the destruction of the temple. But we shifted the holy in what Heschel, which is an American rabbi in the 60s again, called the holiness of time. We've lost the holiness of space because we were not in the land, so the holiness of space became a little bit muted, and we transformed it into the holiness of time, the festivals, Shabbat, and so on. But once we got back into the land, the holiness of the land resurfaced. And because the holiness resurfaced, then somehow working the story of the, reworking, a rabbinic thinking about what is it that is really holy becomes very useful, but it's very controversial. And I think the question you're asking of saying, you know, how many people think like him is not so obvious. I mean, certainly someone like Leibovitch would have thought exactly on the same line. They were belonging to the same movement. They were both mitnagdim, and but it's not common feature. But the fact that it's not common feature doesn't make it less interesting. I think it makes it actually. I like disruptive teaching. There's the common teaching and there's a mainstream, and it's very good because you do need some sort of mainstream. But disruptive teachings are always interesting. And so here comes the kind of surprising part, which is the last few texts that we'll look at, and we'll do whatever we can with them. It's a little bit long. And here it is. And it requires a little bit of thinking. All this is based on, again, Simcha Cohen of Dvinsk in a different book. But let me just say a context about this. The first context is that in order to try to create a different language rather than the language of holiness, okay, we need to do a typical rabbinic exercise, which is to move very far away from the problem of the land, to do a discussion on another halachic topic, and then to relate it to the question of the land. Okay, and this is what's happening here. And when I said that Rabbi Simcha Cohen of Dvinsk was living in a mixed city and he was very much involved with Christians, he was involved with Christians because he was teaching Torah to Christians, which is extremely rare. And it's extremely rare because of the quote that you have at the beginning. And when I read that, I said, okay, I put Talmud Bavli, but I didn't put the tractate. It's in Sanhedrin 59a. It's in Tractate Sanhedrin. That's the name of the tractate. The text here is rough. A Gentile who engaged in Torah study is liable to receive the death penalty. It's you, by the way, right now. Okay? So just beware, all right? As it is stated, Moses commanded us the law an inheritance to the congregation of Jacob, Deuteronomy 33, an inheritance for us and not for them. Therefore, a Gentile who studies Torah robs the Jew of his inheritance. So death penalty, surely for you, surely for me, who's come and teach and what I do in Rome. So I got interested into this text a long time ago because of my work. So I work at the Gregoriana in Rome, and I thought, okay, gosh, what am I really doing? I have to be extremely careful here. But I'm not the only one who had to be careful, because Rabbi Simcha Cohen of Vinsk was also teaching Torah to Gentiles, and he had to find a way around. That's why it's interesting. We have here a violence, not so much a violence of the Torah, but here a violence of the rabbinic tradition. Okay? And just like we had the violence of the Torah HaMelech that we saw on the first day, here we have another kind of violence. And how do you work around by creating another language? So here's the context, and here it's a little bit, let me just explain before we read. He's going to go and search for, so the Or Sameach is the name of the book of Cohen of Dvinsk, and it's a commentary on the Mishneh Torah, which is a book of Maimonides. Okay, so in the Middle Age. What he's going to do, he's going to try and tell a Talmudic story, another Talmudic story, in which someone finds a cake on the street. And the person who finds the cake on the street, so it's far removed from the land, we agree? It's even far removed from the Torah. But you find a cake on the street, you lift up the cake, and in the Talmudic time, they had their slaves. Okay, so the rabbi has a slave who works for him, and he gives him the cake. And the rabbis come and said, it's forbidden to give a present to an idolater. Why do you give the cake to the slave? You're not allowed to give the cake to the slave. And the Talmudic story finds a way out of this problematic, and Rabbi Meyer Simcha Cohen of Dvinsk is using that to say, I'm going to compare the Torah to the cake. I lift up the Torah, I picked up the Torah on the street, in the wilderness. I give it to whoever I want, just like the rabbi gives the cake to whoever he wants. And from there, he says, what is the status of the object that I've lifted up from the ground? What is the status of the Torah that I've lifted up from the ground? Can I find a different terminology that is not the language of holiness, that allows me to think beyond possession? That allows me to think beyond, it is an inheritance, and if I give it to anyone else, I'm robbed from it. And from there, the next step of the logic, which is not done by Simcha Cohen of Dvinsk, but which I suggested in an article, is that there's only two things that are in inheritance, the Torah and the land of Israel. Those are the two only things that are called an inheritance. If it works for the Torah, it works for the land of Israel. So it's a kind of a rabbinic development with a kind of a contemporary twist to it. So that's, if you want, the spirit of what we're going to read. Is that okay? Just to get the context right? Okay, so it's a rabbinic text. It's a bit dry, maybe, even though there is a narrative in it, so it helps. For Rabbi Yehuda, we hold, according to his opinion, whatever the previous thing was, but he taught us a new detail in the Yerushalmi, which is the second version, the earliest version of the Talmud. So the Talmud, you have the Babylonian Talmud, which was compiled like 7th century, Babylonian Talmud 7th century, Jerusalem Talmud a little bit before 5th century. So it's a story from the Yerushalmi on the teaching of you have to show them no mercy towards the non-Jew. So really in the heart of that religious violence that occupies us today. And following Maimonides on do not give them an undeserved present, it is told the following. A story about Ramban Gamliel, so one of the very well-known head of the Jewish Academy in the Talmudic time, who was walking on the road and he saw a cake lying on the road. And he said to Tabi, his servant, to take this cake and he saw a Gentile coming towards him. And he said to Tabi, his servant, give him the cake. So there are three people involved. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, his servant, who's picking up the cake, and a Gentile who's arriving, and Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel said to his servant, give the cake to the Gentile. To who does the cake belong? To Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, because the servant has no legal entity. So whatever the servant takes only belongs to the owner, so to Shimon ben Gamliel. So suddenly, the servant is a kind of a messenger in between, okay? And therefore, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel has a possession, and he decides to give the possession to someone for which it is says, show them no mercy, do not give them any undeserved present. And so the Talmud asks himself, well, how can he do that? He's transgressing the law. Okay? And Rabbi Eli ran after him and said to him, what is your name? And he answered, Magbai. And again, where are you coming from? And he answered, from the city of the station guard. And he said to him, have you ever met Rabban Gamliel in your life? And he answered, no. That means we're trying to inquire about the identity of this Gentile who comes. Maybe he's not really an idol worshiper. Maybe he's someone who was living with Jews, and so therefore that's why Rabban Gamliel could give it to him, because he was not really a Jew, but he was what we call the ger toshav. He was a stranger, an alien resident that was part of us in which the laws are different. He said, no, I never heard of this guy. I'm coming from another city. I'm a total stranger, okay? And since there was no further resolution to the difficulty, it is clear that his intention is that something that is the financial property of the Jew, so the cake here, is forbidden to give to a non-Jew. That I know from the law. But something that is efker, okay, you see the terms, efker, something that is called efker, and I'll explain that in a minute, and that has not yet belonged to him, it is permitted to give even to a worshipper of idol. So what the text does of Simcha Cohen of Dvinsk is to say, I don't want now to talk about possession. The rule in Judaism is that if you find an object here, okay, I find an object, the act of lifting up is considered as an act of acquisition. Okay? So it's an act of acquisition. Here, the servant lifts up the object, the cake. Because the servant doesn't have an identity of his own, then the acquisition is in fact done by the master. So it looks like the acquired object is acquired, and how come an acquired object that becomes the possession of a Jew can be given to a non-Jew and shared to a non-Jew? And the answer is, yes, but you forgot one rule, which is the rule of efker, which is the abandoned object found in the public domain. It's different than you find it in the private domain, but if you find it in the public domain, there are objects which are efker, and the lifting up is not necessarily an act of possession in that case. So I am technically doing an act of acquisition, of ownership, of property. It's mine. But at the same time, because of the status of the object, the initial status of the object, there is a permissibility of the law to go beyond your possession that you're not allowed to share. So he goes on and he says, and therefore Tabi, his slave, does not have ownership of himself as a slave, since what a slave owns should be considered as owned by his master. Who should have been the owner? Rabban Gamliel. But he did not intend to own it, but only to lift it so as to respect the commandment, do not pass by food that is found on the ground. He lifted up the object not because he wanted to take possession of the object. He lifted up the object because there's another commandment that says, when there is food on the ground, do not pass by it without picking it up. Respect for the food. This is what he was doing it. He wasn't doing it for the purpose of possession, for absolute possession. Absolute possession would lead to the impossibility to share it. But if you were doing it for another purpose, then the idea of sharing the possession becomes possible. Therefore, it is permitted to give to the Gentile. And they already wrote about that in the Tosafot on Baba Batra, that's kind of internal reference, that if one knows that something is placed in his hand but does not intend to claim possession, then this is not an act of acquisition, since there, in addition, it still constitutes a case of hefker, and he can very well give it to the Gentile. So you see the dynamic of what he's trying to do. And then what is interesting, of course, is, okay, so what he's going to do with that, he's going to say, now, I'm going to use this with the Torah. I'm going to use exactly the same thing with the Torah. The only thing that I need to prove is that the Torah is hefker. Rather than holy, I'm going to call the Torah hefker, an object that is found in a place that belongs to nobody. And how does he do that? He do that with what comes after. Okay, he quotes different kind of text. The first one is, okay, the reference doesn't matter. And God spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai. You remember what we read, the very first text, okay? Sinai is a problematic text because on Sinai, not only the Torah was given, but the Sinah, the Sinai, the Sinah came down to the world. The hatred came down to the world. But here it does something else. And God spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, Numbers. Why the Sinai wilderness? Anyone who does not make himself ownerless like the wilderness cannot acquire the wisdom of the Torah. And that's why it says the Sinai wilderness. When you receive the Torah, and if you want to receive the Torah, which is in the wilderness, you have to place yourself in a spiritual position of ownerlessness. You never receive the Torah if you think you're acquiring. The Torah, in its essence, required hefker. So that's the term I keep using. Okay, it requires ownerlessness. And again, you have another text about it. And they travel from Rephidim, which was one of the posts during the 40 years in the wilderness, and they came to the desert of Sinai, in a desert place in the world, so that it will always be said that in a deserted place in the world, the Torah was given to Israel. For had it been given in the land of Israel, the children of Israel would have said, it is ours. And had it been given into another place, the inhabitant of that place would have said, it's ours. Therefore, it was given in the most deserted of place, so that all who want to receive it can receive it. So the idea that the Torah is given in a place of hefker, of ownerlessness, okay, becomes an important operative factor in the thought of Simcha Cohen of Dvinsk. And from there, he makes this kind of connection of saying something that is ownerless, if I pick it up, but I don't have the intention to own it, which is a necessity here, I'm allowed to share. And his thinking is not about the land of Israel. His thinking is about, can I teach Torah to non-Jews? And his answer is, yes, I can teach Torah to non-Jews, because instead of talking about the holiness of the Torah as such, as an intrinsic holiness, I'm talking about the Torah as ownerless, okay? I am not in a situation of acquiring. I am not in a session of putting my hands on it. I'm not in a possession of holding it, okay? And therefore, that allows me to share and to, therefore, continue as he does to teach to non-Jews. And the thing he does after that is, you can argue and you can say, yes, but it still says somewhere that it's an inheritance. You know, so it's all nice to say it's hefker, it belongs to nobody. But somehow it's still an inheritance. How are you going to come around that term? I understand you don't want to talk about the holy, but think about the land. Let's say I'm not talking about the Holy Land, but I talk about the inheritance of the land. It's the result is very similar. It's terms of possession. So he uses in his text another passage, which is this one here, from the Talmud Yerushalmi. And this is a very surprising text. Rabbi Yochanan answered, quoting Exodus 6:8, And I will bring you into the land concerning which I swore to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, and I will give it, v'natati ota, I will give it to you as an inheritance, morasha. I am the Lord. The Talmud questions the language of Exodus 6:8. He says, since the verse uses two different words, namely, it is a matana, it is a gift. V'natati ota, natan is to give as a gift. Okay, v'natati ota, it's a matana. And at the same time, it's a morasha, an inheritance. Why do I need the two words? Just tell me that it's an inheritance. Tell me it's a gift. I mean, I don't need to say it's a gift and it's an inheritance. Okay, why the two words? So the Talmud says, if it is a gift, matana, why do I need to be told that it's an inheritance, yerusha? And if it's an inheritance, a yerusha, why does it say that it's a gift? I don't need two terms. Rabbi Yochanan answered, after God gave it to them as a matana, he gave it to them as an inheritance, yerusha. That's not very convincing. It's just like, okay, first he gave it to them as a gift and then as an inheritance. But Rabbi Oshaya said, and this is more interesting, in every place where it says inheritance, this must be considered as ambiguous language. Inheritance carries with it ambiguity. It's a language of ambiguity. Yet it also says, Morashat Keilat Yaakov, that Moses commanded us the Torah, the inheritance of the community of Jacob, the inheritance of the community of Jacob. Would you say that this inheritance as well is ambiguous? That God gave to Israel the Torah, is that ambiguous? And the answer is yes. No situation is more ambiguous than this, since without efforts, one cannot receive and comprehend the Torah. Inheritance of the Torah is by definition ambiguous. I mean, this is absolutely astonishing. Okay? The whole of Judaism is based on God gave us the Torah. And the Talmudic text says there is nothing more ambiguous than an inheritance. Okay, which is an absolutely fascinating text. It's hard to get because the rabbinic tradition is very condensed. It doesn't develop its ideas, but it kind of opens a window. Now, what is interesting with this is to say, okay, so can I then use this notion of hefker to bypass the holiness and the inheritance of the land? Not that I refuse any rights on the land. Jews have a right on land. Jews have an history. Jews have a necessity, the need for this necessary relation to the land. We've seen what happened when we have no land, so it's not a joke. But if we take it a little bit too far, it's of course also problematic because it can become very exclusivist. So in order to fight this kind of exclusivist attitude about either the Holy Land or the inheritance of the land, can I use the hefker? And to say that the Torah is the land of Israel somehow is an hefker, an object that somehow can be shared, just like the Torah, just like the cake. And here you can see it opens a perspective of shared land. It opens a perspective of something else than it's just mine or it's only yours, but if it's yours, it's nothing of mine, and vice versa. So, because that's kind of what I'm interested in. In order to do that, the link that is missing, and I'll finish with this because there's one more minute, so I'll finish now. But the last text that you have in the documents that I have is just about comparing, in a very interesting way, the land to a book. The land is suddenly compared to a book. When the Lord shall enlarge your borders, is it possible that the Holy One, blessed be He, can enlarge the land of Israel? Rabbi Yitzchak said, this scroll, this book, that one takes when rolled up, no one knows what its length and its breadth. But once it's open and it's spread out, its size is then revealed. So it is with the land of Israel, most of it being mountains and valleys. Whence this? Because it is said so and so. And therefore, the text here, we don't need to read all of it, but the text here says the land is like a scroll. And it's a scroll, you never know exactly what its borders, how far it goes, and what's hidden underneath above it, and so on. And here you have a text that enables you to say, interestingly, there is a rabbinic text that connects the land to the idea of the book. The idea of the book is connected to the idea of the Torah, which is connected to the inheritance. The land is also an inheritance. The two connects with each other. Somehow it relates to the cake. It becomes a case of hefker. And the hefker says, I have a right to it, but I also have a right to share, even if the violence of the text tells me that it's holy and it's mine. And so here you have, I think, the possibility to create, if you want, a language of peace that somehow can deactivate the time bomb that Gershom Scholem was talking about when we started. So I'll stop it here because of time constraint, but I hope it gave you a little bit of a glance into different aspects of the question of the violence and how to go around it. And just wanted to thank you really for inviting me and to Veronique to organize that and everybody who organized that, and for you to having been present for the different days and for the discussion we had at the beginning. It was very pleasant and very nice. So thank you very much.